That's wild, bro. I never seen this.
Isn't that wild?
I never seen this.
Black movie is, well, I know one when I see one.
This movie was lost.
I think about how much was lost through hatred, through ignorance.
Hey, I'm Justin Simien, the filmmaker and executive producer behind Hollywood Black. I'm so excited to be in the IndieWire offices in New York City, and I'm here to record the IndieWire Filmmaker Toolkit podcast.
I was always a fan of the podcast that you started.
Thank you.
There's a connective tissue here. You chopping it up with your friends. Did this kind of grow out of that to a certain degree? Talking about, I mean, obviously there's Donald Bogle's book, a deep history here, but did the idea of this kind of format come from that?
Absolutely. I mean, the podcast was interesting because I always knew if nothing else, I could just do what I did with the podcast. And when it became like clear that this wasn't just something I was researching and wanting to talk about, it was something I wanted to like make, and it was something that needed to exist. You know, for the moonshot was, okay, maybe it's a documentary or a docu-series, but I knew I could always just do it as a podcast, you know, and actually have the kind of conversations I wanted to have, you know, with my peers, and maybe with some legends too, if I could find them. But definitely when we were able to get with Forrest Whitaker in particular, his company, that's really when it sort of became a much bigger situation.
Because we're so used to this, you know, sitting down, talking to, you know, hearing historians or hearing filmmakers and artists talking in a very sit down for interview. But one of the things here is an exploration, you know, for some that, and no criticism on them, don't know, you know, you're watching clips, you know, or being able to get like Ryan Coogler's reaction in real time to certain things, which comes from a little, there's something about that that's almost welcoming in this, like kind of like a welcome into this history to a certain degree.
Well, it's funny. Every time I see the word definitive, I keep asking it to be removed because I'm like, we are in no way near in a position to claim this to be definitive. We are in a lot of ways still rediscovering this history, and that sense of discovery for me, like I wanted to try to capture that as much as possible. You know, when I see some of these movies and discover some of these filmmakers, I am in rapture. I am in awe. I am angry. I am so shocked because it's not what you think. It's not sort of what you were conditioned to believe was there when you finally uncover it. It is, some of the work is so sophisticated, so brilliant. You can't believe this was somehow erased or removed from the timeline. I absolutely wanted to capture those reactions. I felt like that was really vital to make this not sort of like a history lesson, but you understand that this stuff is like really relevant to people's lives right now.
Right. I want to start with something that you start with just to get our audience orientated here. And this is, you make this point very early on. Every time Hollywood tries to reinvent itself or expand its reach, it tends to do so with black bodies, consciously or not. And there's a little cut to Darth Vader, consciously or not.
Because that stuff is real.
But I'm wondering, that's something that's kind of an underlying element here. I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, I think that the profound shift in my thinking, my own thinking about this is I went from feeling like an outsider who was not able to break my way into this thing that was unfathomable, the cinema thing that was invented by like Thomas Edison and the Lumiere brothers and all these white people. And then the more I read the history, it was like, no, this was our land first. It actually was. And there's a reason why, even though you might see white people tap dancing or singing to jazz music or playing characters that come out of our sort of narrative styles, but there was always this fascination and desire to appropriate Black culture in cinema. It is there from the very beginning. And it's interesting that we are conditioned to kind of talk about Birth of a Nation as a masterpiece that happens to be racist. And in my view, no, it being racist was actually a clear reason for its success because Americans were so entertained by and used to going and paying whatever money to sit down for 2 hours and be entertained and riveted by these Black stereotypes. It was built into the popular culture of America. And once you start to realize, okay, so minstrelsy is the start of all entertainment in America. And then vaudeville is kind of minstrelsy, but with European influences. And cinema comes out of vaudeville. We were literally already there from the start. And every time we need a new innovation, again, and I don't know that it's always conscious, but yeah, it's Birth of a Nation, and then it's, you know, Al Jolson singing Mammy, and then it's, slave narratives becoming these big sci-fi epics. So yeah, it's something that I see that to me is kind of clear as day, but not everyone really talks about it, but it completely changed my perspective. I didn't feel, I don't know, quite as alien, quite as isolated in my experience.
One huge hole for me in my film history knowledge that it was one of the first things it was right in the first episode that I really latched onto. I would love to talk a little bit is about Burt Williams.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought him up.
Because someone who loves, and to be honest, even academically studied the Silent Clowns, I cannot believe how little I know.
Correct.
There's this incredible moment when Odessa Warren Gray, who is the leading lady of the film, and Burt Williams are kissing. I can't help but wonder, what is it like for her to be kissing this guy in blackface?
Burt Williams' appearance in blackface basically allows for every other cast member to not wear blackface.
The kiss.
It's jarring. It's like there's a non-human entity on the screen.
Yeah. And I would really love to know what is the mentality of forcing someone black to be in blackface to make it palatable for a white audience. Why is that more palatable?
Burt Williams, how did he fall into I tend to rabbit hole, and for no other reason. I was just consuming so much stuff from the turn of the century, images and stuff, and I kept coming across, we actually, I think everyone has a certain illustration. They just don't know it's Burt Williams of a man in blackface, kind of with like a downturned smile, and he kind of looks like a blackface clown. Burt Williams was actually the first black superstar, and he was the first black man on Broadway. He was the first black man to be featured in the Ziegfeld Follies. He was the star attraction when they could actually get him in one of these things. And all, Charlie Chaplin, W.C. Fields, all of those vaudeville stars that were trying to figure out how to translate what they were doing into pictures, they studied Burt Williams because he was a master of that style of comedy. And seeing contrasted the blackface image with him as a man, it just sort of, I don't know, I suddenly saw myself in the past. He was dealing with this horrible caricature that as a black performer, you could not avoid. You had to wear, he was a light-skinned black man, so he was basically forced to wear blackface. And somehow he inhabited that and pushed against the expectations of that and created this kind of wise guy character who everyone assumed was so slow and so ignorant and so stupid, but actually he was the smartest man there. And you can see that character go on to become Bugs Bunny, Rodney Dangerfield. You see that sort of archetype that he invented out of necessity go on, and everything from the dress, the sort of, the white glove and the white sock showing and the black shoes. And you see that show up again with Ben Vereen, and you see it show up again with Michael Jackson. His influence, I don't think, has ever been appropriately calculated, actually. But it is vast. And yet his story is almost completely just outside of any educational curriculum about this subject. And that is a consequence of him being a black man. He was the biggest performer on Broadway, and yet he couldn't even drink in the bar of the theater he was performing in. It's quite a story.
Because I haven't seen the films, there was two things that instantly fascinated me in listening to you and your, I don't want to say friends, the other filmmakers, I guess a lot of them are friends, talking about him. One was that the stories were working on two levels. They were delivering the kind of, white genre expectation of minstrelsy, but then he was subtly, or maybe he wasn't, at least subtle to the point that the white audience was actually there was a movie there that black audiences were connecting with that was, again, I guess, a little bit subverting some of the bumbling.
Yeah. In black culture, it's called signifying. It just hasn't, we don't really use that term when we talk about cinema or entertainment. You think about it more as it relates to maybe like hip hop, where, people understand that rappers work in double and triple and quadruple entendres, and a line can just sound fun to you, but actually it has all these deep layers and meanings. Black people do this in music and in literature, but we've been doing it in film too. Yes, he is in blackface, and yes, he is playing a bumbling dolt, but he's the only one on the stage, for instance. I'm just pulling something out of my head, like in a play like Into Homie, which is the first black Broadway show, years before Shuffle Along. they're concocting a plan to leave America as black people and go to the country of Dahomey where they've just overthrown their enslavers. Now that is an extremely radical storyline to kind of Trojan horse inside what ostensibly is a bunch of shucking and jiving. And best believe the black audience who had to sit at the top, in the balcony seats and the nosebleeds, they were absorbing a totally different story performance experience from Burt Williams and the folks, the white folks in the front.
That's a big topic too. Like
Yes.
that's a big. It's like
huge.
Just to like
And you're like, this was 1913.
Yeah.
They did this.
Yeah.
What? It's remarkable.
The other thing, and I just want to make sure I was clear on this. He did the blackface, but in a way, because he was the lead, it allowed the other black performers to not.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, so Line Kiln Film Club Day. I always kind of get the title mixed up. I don't even think it's the official title. They're just like trying to figure out what to call it. But what was supposed to be the first all-black feature that was kind of lost to time. This is Burt Williams, one of his, film acting.
This is the thing that MoMA discovered like a decade ago.
MoMA discovered. Yeah, exactly. He is the only actor wearing blackface, and it just sort of allows. It's crazy because you don't see it written down anywhere, but you just have to imagine it allows a potential white audience to calm down enough to accept other black people on the screen. Because if he did it, his co-stars didn't have to do it, particularly if they weren't leads. And I think that's a fascinating statement of the time, but it does create this sort of, you can't help but watch several things at once. This is not a person on screen. This is a kind of like a cartoon character, person who is kissing the female lead. And it's an interesting thing to have to do in your mind. And the funny thing is one of the reasons people say that movie is lost to time is because even that was too radical for the time. People couldn't even accept that. They weren't ready for even that.
The other huge hole for me, and actually, you said something here. I want to read it. There was, you were talking about film school, and you got Oscar Micheaux, you got your flash forward to black exploitation.
Yes.
Do the right thing. We're out. Obviously there's something missing there. But I think one of the things that's missing for all of us is what they called the race films, which I guess helped me with my timeline here. Like right around 1920 or so, Oscar's starting to make some of these indie films, independent films. And then we have a segregated theater system, right? So especially in the big cities, right? There's black theaters. So there's content, I think almost like 500 films over kind of like pushing past
quite a bit,
like World War II that were specifically, and we just don't see these,
we
right?
don't see them, yeah.
I mean, obviously those who did go to film school or those films are known to us, but the idea that there was a whole theater distribution system of black films
that Oscar Micheaux innovated out of necessity. And there were 500 films. There was nobody really who cared enough or had the resources to preserve those films. So we just sort of gloss over that in the history. But it was incredibly important, and it was a big deal to Hollywood too. The evidence that you can find is after World War II, the Hollywood system essentially starts absorbing and appropriating as much of that independent black cinema as they can. What they don't take along with them, however, are the black producers, writers, and directors. So you see, the problem pictures that emerge that, eventually give rise to someone like Sidney Poitier, who became a big enough star to where he was able to wrest some control over the narratives that were being told. But that's all we kind of have, really, are of those race films, or remnants like that, where Hollywood recognizes, okay, black characters and black subjects do generate a lot of profits, and we want that money. We don't want them to have it in their own independent enclave anymore. But hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of films. There were, black cowboys and westerns and musicals and every genre you could imagine, but with black actors.
So there's about 500. I think 100 survive somewhere in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, so that means we've lost 80% of that history, which is devastating. But of the 100, because I think I probably have only seen Micheaux's films.
Yeah,
there's directors here to discover, right?
Yeah,
Is this stuff like out on DVD? Is it readily available?
Some of it's on YouTube. I think some of it is, one of the things that kind of jump-started this for me is in 2020, the George Floyd protests sort of for a moment, we were changing the way we were thinking about some of these things. And so like Criterion, for instance, started to surface, restore, and reclaim and recover some of these films. There was a big exhibit at the Academy in Los Angeles called Regeneration, where they would screen some of these movies. And I was able to access some of those for the first time myself, not sort of like a weird scan on YouTube, but actually like on a big screen. So some of it is available. But I think the cultural impact of it and the weight of what that must have felt like, that was lost on me, frankly,
Right.
just hearing little tidbits here and there until I could see it in front of my face and like imagine what that might have been like. Like, can you imagine that right now? Like that doesn't, it's not that I want anything to be segregated, but just there was so much work happening.
Right.
And film is one of those things where like you can't really get good at it real quick. Like you have to be doing it a lot and be exposed to it and trying things. And it's just so much harder to get that kind of experience or even imagine that in Hollywood now.
The thing is, I think most people know that kind of later Hollywood, those problem films. In some ways, when they're dealing with those issues, they feel dated.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know? They
Yes.
feel like the absorption of, some of the talent on screen transcends that. In some of those great films. But it's the thing that's always amazing about Oscar Michaud's films is they feel so,
Yes.
Relevant. They feel so
Yes.
timely. They feel something
it's narratives about Black people told by a Black person. And that's what is missing from those problem films. It is very much the Black experience starring Black people, but written by and geared towards white people and their feelings about it. I
guess that's the thing that your doc makes the point of all the time. It's
Yeah.
made for it's who's the audience.
It's who's the audience and who's making it. And that sort of that dance, you see that throughout the timeline, throughout cinema. You get to something like The Help or Crash, and some people don't get what the controversy is. I think Black people get it immediately. And some people do get it, but you're like, where does that come from? Where does that divide come from? Oh, that divide was there in the beginning. There's always this dance between authentic Black culture and appropriated Black culture, even in this space.
What's the famous Spike Lee line at the Oscars?
Oh,
not
gosh,
my
so many.
cup of tea.
Oh yeah, exactly. And Elvis Mitchell, who speaks briefly in this film, and he has a great docu-series on Netflix, I think it is.
It is
about blaxploitation. He actually made this point that I didn't even know, and I was so glad to have his perspective on this. Of even with blaxploitation, once blaxploitation was done and over with and put away, the archetypes, that anti-hero of that badass dude who doesn't care, that was from blaxploitation, and they just did that with like white people in the 80s. And it's sort of like, oh my God, it never stops. It never stops. So
by the way, a little plug, anybody wants to go back in the archive, Elvis was on talking about that. Netflix.
Oh, great.
I think it was last November, right?
Elvis is so great.
Yeah.
Just the coolest.
He has a line that I want to come back to in this one.
Oh, sure.
Because
Great.
what he had to say about Eddie Murphy was fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
There's a thing here, and IndieWire is just as guilty of it as anybody, is like there's a kind of myopic view of independent film. It's like there was John Cassavetes and then
Yes.
Spike and Jarmusch and Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and boom, the 90s. And one of the things in watching your doc that I kept coming back to is the history of Black cinema, is the history of
Independent
independence.
cinema, absolutely.
Almost all the stuff in this
Yes.
that we're talking about is, because some of the financing here of even of the first half of the 20th century,
Yeah.
that was news to me too, is that
Yes.
these are people literally giving,
Donating.
it's almost like it reminded me of Dear White People, the Kickstarter,
Absolutely. No, Oscar Michaud literally went door to door. He literally went door to door, literally had contribution programs, and then the movie you contribute to made money, so he'd be back for a little bit more. I mean, he really found a way to make this happen. Yeah.
Speaking of independent films, because there's a few in here that I highlighted, just jumping forward a little bit, one of the things that I found really moving was, and you address this in the film, one of the motivations for you wanting to make this film was discovering later in your life Sidewalk Stories.
Absolutely. Sidewalks, I mean, there were two, symbiocytotoxoplasm, which people knew about, and William Greaves certainly had, I remember he was on the Criterion channel and all that.
Yeah.
Charles Lane, though, Sidewalk Stories really pissed me off when I saw it, because it is so good, and it is brilliant in ways that I just didn't expect or anticipate, and in ways that we awarded another film for being, later, which is The Artist. And I know I don't mean to compare them. It's tough to compare films in an artistic sense, but for me, it made so clear we just are playing with different resource levels. We are playing in different arenas, and great artistic achievement for Black artists, it just doesn't translate to the same kind of market relevance as it does for white artists. And it is crazy to me that this movie, there wasn't enough room for Do the Right Thing and Sidewalk Stories in the public consciousness for 1989, because they both come out that year.
And I think the thing is, it went to Cannes.
Yeah.
It wasn't that people didn't recognize.
Yes, they
that
knew it was brilliant.
People saw this thing.
You see, there's clips of Spike Lee at Cannes talking about how incredible that movie is. So people knew about it, but it just didn't get that distribution. It didn't get that hot pop culture. It's not loud Black people. It's not hip hop. It's literally a silent film. Mm-hmm. It's a little odd. It's a little tender. It's black and white. It's all of these things that was not in vogue for Blackness at that time, and it just didn't get the pop.
And the thing is like, it's one thing for a film like that to not maybe be a commercial success. Do you know? Because I mean,
yes.
there are films like that, black and white, that are kind of like. But I think there is an element, though, is when a white filmmaker would make something like that. Not that they would, but something of that merit. There's a buzz that surrounds them.
Yes.
Of like what's next?
What's next? Yes, and they don't just sort of fade away without a story.
Right.
Daughters of the Dust is the same way. The thing about Daughters of the Dust is that Julie Dash is someone who. Enough of us told the story, even though pop culture wasn't telling us the story, and said, hey, you got to see Daughters of the Dust, to where she had a moment. And especially when Beyonce is kind of adapting some of those aesthetics for Lemonade, there's a public consciousness around Daughters of the Dust. But
25 years later.
Many years later. Sidewalk Stories, didn't quite get that same thing, but there's also so many films and filmmakers that are in that category. It's kind of up to us to find out about them and to talk loudly about them and make a big deal, because nobody else is going to. It's just not important enough to anybody else. And Sidewalk Stories was one of those I could not believe it had fallen through the cracks like that.
I'm glad to hear Bill Graves' great film was another one, because that thing to me. Please don't make me try and say it. I could try that.
Symbio.
Symbio. But I mean, that thing, you see it and it feels 5 decades ahead of it. I mean, it feels ahead of us now.
Fresh. It is so fresh. That one, because the thing is, as a Black filmmaker, and this is not everybody's experience, but I often am am I being gaslit? I don't know where or how, but I just feel like my experience of reality is different than what everyone is telling me. And I would often have this sense that I think everyone's being really nice to me and everyone seems really glad that I'm here, but I feel like they're all plotting against me. And somewhere
in the back room, the crew is kind of
am I paranoid? And then you see Symbio Psycho talks about it was 1968, and it is so funny. It is so sharp because the movie that they're making, which is not really the movie that they're making, but it also feels like it's just it's very shock. It's very, identity politics at war in the streets. It's just very the kind of movie that you could think being made by a Black director with a white crew today. Mm-hmm. And then you see this white crew acknowledge him as someone so great that they respect, and then sort of pat themselves on the back for working with this Black director in 1968 on such edgy material. But the minute they are left alone, they are absolutely plotting to overthrow him. And the genius is that he used that footage in the film. They didn't know. They filmed themselves for some reason, I think because they are obsessed with themselves and how brilliant they are and how they can help save this movie in their minds. And Bill Greaves comes across this footage and puts it in the movie. And it's, I've never felt seen in that way as what I do for a living in the way I felt seeing that movie.
And I think what's amazing is that if you just were to pick that movie up and throw it in, you'd kind of in Ava in your movies a little that's staged, right?
Yeah, you're that can't possibly have happened that way, but it did. It's wild. It's wild. But he, the brilliance of William Greaves in that film, and you see this. I think this is really the basis of how reality TV is made. He understood that when people were on camera, something else turns on. There's some other part of them that they normally keep very hidden away that kind of takes over. He knew that. And he just sort of allowed everything, all the materials that would need for drama to pop off. He allowed that to just be there. He allowed it. He allowed scenarios where they might be in a room together and have access to equipment. And he created this environment where anything could happen. And he was also smart enough to be like, okay, wow, that happened. I'm going to include that. I'm going to make that a part of the story. So yeah, it's just, it's genius on display. I don't know that he had a plan in the beginning that this would all turn out that way, but he was smart enough to use it.
One thing that your doc did that gave me a new lens on a history I very much knew, because I'm of that age when Eddie Murphy was blowing up in the 80s. I was too young to see the stuff, but because thank God for HBO, I could, so I was seeing all those movies way too young, and he was such a big deal for everybody. And so and he's very talented. I mean, no knock on him. He's extremely talented, but I always thought, here, the story with him was, here was a guy who broke through to stardom and to make money. And it was very interesting the way that your film positioned this, which is if you think about him in context of Pryor was a groundbreaking stand-up who just, had an incredible impact. But, when it came to films, not that he didn't make his money or not that he wasn't bankable for Hollywood, but he needed to be like that Superman sidekick. Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting. I think it was Elvis Mitchell who said he was the first one that didn't care, didn't need the approval of his white co-star. Yeah. And to see Eddie Murphy walking through that door is a lens that I don't think I had on those films.
Yeah, Eddie Murphy, the thing about a black artist of any stripe in this documentary, and I think life, is they can't just be an artist. They also have to have a dynamism about them to navigate the unspoken racial scenarios. And that was the genius of Eddie Murphy he didn't cater to the white characters in the film. And it made but he did it in a way that you loved him. You didn't resent him for it. And he understood that, it's going back to Burt Williams, he understood he was playing to dual audiences. He had to make white people comfortable. And I think that's what that laugh is about. And I think that's just what that charisma and that gleam in his eye is about. But once he's got y'all calmed down and taken care of, he is delivering to us some radical stuff, okay? And to have a character in an ostensibly black-white series of black-white buddy movies, and the black guy is the one we're all talking about afterwards, that is brilliant. That's brilliant. And nobody has had a string of hits like him. He really sort of through the decades just kept coming with something new, a new take on that.
It's hard to capture in the 80s how big MJ was and how big Eddie Murphy was in terms of the culture and how because we have stars now, but that was like a black hole of just interest in driving comedy culture or pop music.
Because they had to be extraordinary. They had to just be mind-meltingly extraordinary in order to break through just the crush of. Because I think, and again, I didn't grow up in that time, but it feels like everyone was just sort of satisfied with the status quo. And that was not going to be good enough for the ambitions of somebody like Michael Jackson or Eddie Murphy. And so they had to break through in these extraordinary ways that just sort of stopped popular culture in its tracks. And that's what they did. And it is wild to watch it kind of unfold.
And the one that's particularly wild to watch in retrospect was 48 Hours before because after 48 Hours, he's big.
It's different.
He can go make his Eddie Murphy movies.
Yes.
To watch that happen in the structure of that film is crazy.
And to me, it's exactly what Burt did. You walk into the roles that you're given because this is where we're at today. This is where the culture is at. But once I'm in there though, I'm messing stuff up. I'm knocking the vases down. I'm letting y'all know I'm here and I'm not intending to leave anytime soon. And that's exactly what you see happen. And the switch in culture in his career is so clear after 48 Hours.
90s, which I think is the whole episode 3, right?
Yeah. So for the most part, yeah.
So I don't want to be overly. I don't want to boil this down too much, but it feels as if the documentary and many of the guests that you interviewed, and maybe even yourself, the 90s feel like a double-edged sword here.
Yes.
Because there is an explosion of Hollywood making black films, hiring black talent behind and in front of the camera. And some of them are great films, but it feels like there's something I'm wondering if you talk about that because I feel like episode 3 really kind of handles what that moment was like.
That's when I grew up, sort of thinking about movies and thinking about the kind of stories I would tell. And it is double-edged because, like you said, there's an aspect of Blackness that is being celebrated. But then it becomes appropriated, and then it becomes a trap. Then it becomes, the new status quo that we're all trying to break through. And in the 90s, it felt like, and I think Spike actually doesn't get the credit. I mean, he gets a lot of credit that he deserves, but he should get even more credit because Do the Right Thing kind of is the movie that opens us up to these so-called street narratives that can be done in an artistic way, but also feel authentically Black, also feel very hip hop. And you see that kind of take off. And just like with the Blaxploitation, movement, it gets overdone and it becomes tropey and it just becomes like a thing that they're doing. Meanwhile, other kinds of Black work, such as like Sidewalk Stories, such as Daughters of the Dust, such as things that maybe don't hit that same pop culture idea of what Black is, those things get kind of overlooked, while the things that are being celebrated, it becomes a bit of a trap. It becomes a bit of a new form of oppression. Now I have to be like that in order to be Black enough or in order to be seen. So it's kind of like, it's sort of where I came of age in terms of my thinking about some of these things. And I have to say, like, it is always true. Like, I long for a universe where I get to sort of make artistic decisions in a bubble, but you have to be incredibly strategic and you have to read the room. You have to, okay, where are we at now on the cycle of historical slave epics? Where are we at now on the, the Black lead in an otherwise white superhero movie? Like, where are we at? And which choice do I make? And is that going to get me another 5 years in my career? Is that going to, when do I make my masterpiece? Do I do it now? Do I start telling people now and make the cheap version? Do I try to bank on my career going better later? You have to be constantly thinking of these things. And for me, the 90s is where I learned that.
It's so unusual to think about it, and living through it, it's one thing, but to think Boys in the Hood, which is a great film, that launched a genre.
Yeah.
Do you know, 'cause I don't think anybody would watch that movie and be like, it's a great movie.
Right.
But that would be a convention, that its popularity, that movie broke through so much that it's like, oh, we want lots of inner city violence.
Yeah. And, yeah, and that's what happened. I mean, but it's a story of hip hop. So many of those artists, Tupac Shakur, you see them as young people before they get their record deal, and they are sensitive, young men who happen to, have some experience in the hood or whatever that might mean for them. And then it becomes like the hardened identity that they can't escape. Popular culture does that to Black people. It does that to everybody, of course, but I think you can really see it in us.
One thing I was really happy you captured, because it might be hard to do in a 4-hour doc, John Singleton's, beyond his talent, his poise and his understanding of the industry at fucking 22 years old.
I can't believe it.
Right?
It's the sophistication with which he spoke about these things.
But even just listening to the backstories of how he had his career in mind and how he broke through and how he used every opportunity, it was that's something that's hard to
absolutely to fathom. Yeah, and helpful to see it because, I like a lot of Black filmmakers, I read all of the Spike Lee books that he wrote about each of his, but then to actually see these people in motion, to see them dressed up and just 23 or whatever and doing things that I know I couldn't have done at 23. It's remarkable. And it also tells you, oh, you can do it. You can do it. They did it. You can do it.
Chapter 4, episode 4 is really kind of building off the like, okay, well, the 90s did this, what was missing? Now, and I think the way you posed it, let me see, is what stories do we tell now that we have the choice? And in some ways, that just even looking at the last 2 decades through that lens is an optimistic lens. And the films you highlight.
It's a bit optimistic, intentionally. And I will admit that because it doesn't always feel like a choice. It often does not feel like a choice, but we have a little bit more room to move just in terms of the narratives that we tell. Because at the end of the day, maybe a big studio isn't going to make your movie and maybe an independent financer isn't going to make your movie, but you can still get the word out there. Dear white people before I could make it a movie, it was a Twitter account. It was a YouTube page. I had a fake trailer on YouTube that got me on CNN. You know what I'm saying? Like, there are ways to just kind of bypass the gatekeepers that just were not there before. And so I'm going to optimistically say that that's a choice. And even with this documentary series, like, just knowing in the back of my mind, if I never get it made as a documentary, I can still do it as a podcast. Like, that's new. I think that's kind of new. And so I want to encourage everybody, particularly in this time of crisis, of you know, I don't know if you've noticed, but media and entertainment is not doing as well as it used to. There's actually opportunity there. And the same way Melvin Van Peebles faced it when the studio system died in the 60s, the same way, Oscar Micheaux faced it when Birth of a Nation launched horrible violence in this country against Black people. We can use the crisis to our own benefit. And I think that there might be a way to get stories out there that just weren't made before. And that's just the era I think we're in right now.
One question I've always wanted to ask you, and I've wanted to ask Ava, everybody has their jobs that they did beforehand. And I've always wondered with both of you carrying in, because you both broke in doing
PR.
Yeah. And I've just listened. I remember thinking back to that, because when I first was in this business, it was right when you were doing that Dear White People.
Yeah.
And some people who were like kind of mentoring me, like, oh, I remember Justin. It was Paramount. It was like,
yeah.
Oh, he was great. We used to deal with Paramount. And I remember I always saw that through that lens.
Yeah.
And again, filmmaking is filmmaking, great filmmaking. But there is, I always wondered if there was a certain skill or asset that you carried over.
Absolutely. And frankly, as a Black filmmaker, very necessary. I think so many things that were illuminated in this documentary for me is like, wow, that PR side though. Like, if you don't figure out, telling the story is one thing, but then telling people about the story that you told is a whole other thing. And as a shy kid who really had to learn how to speak in front of people, who had to discover, I remember they threw me like, into this like conference with like Hugh Jackman, all these people. This is back when I was a PR assistant, and I had to moderate it, and it scared the crap out of me. And I realized, oh, I can talk. Someone else just kind of takes over when famous people are around. Okay, I can do that. So necessary. Dear White People, nobody was trying to make that movie. And so I created a PR campaign around a movie that didn't exist in order to get the movie made. And then when the movie was made, the people in charge of the PR was like, well, what do you think we should do? You know? And so, yeah, it's been huge, actually. And it felt like a deficit at first. I couldn't after film school, I couldn't figure out how to like pay rent and sort of PA and do what all my other film, student friends were doing. I had to get a job, like a 9-to-5. And I remember working in PR and a 9-to-5, working someone's desk and thinking like, God, am I just wasting my time here? And when I finally got Dear White People to get going, I realized like that was invaluable. And Ava, I got to see that. Ava was actually like, she was the PR woman on the first project I worked on at Focus Features, Something New, which was produced by Stephanie Elaine, she would go on to produce Dear White People. I got a masterclass in how this works, and I got to see her take her very small, intimate stories and figure out a way to talk about them so that it became important and universal to everybody else. That was always like, okay, that's what I got to figure out how to do. Because even when I dabble and move in mainstream spaces, at the core, I am a subversive person. At the core, I want to destroy, the status quo or things about it that I think we've grown past. So I'm always going to need to know how to talk about what I'm doing to people who are maybe not going to lean in as much as I'd like them to actually find out for themselves.
And it feels like in context of this doc too, it's like that element of when the path isn't there, it feels like that background is always you're able to see more roads than maybe someone that doesn't have that background.
Because it's a form of storytelling, it's a different form of storytelling, and the stories you tell are a little bit more transactional. Maybe you're really trying to get at something like go watch this movie, please. But they're both forms of telling a story. And just like I keep going back to it, I would have done this documentary as a podcast. If I had to, like that's still me telling a story.
Well, thank you for doing this podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. I love podcasts.